Hello, and welcome to On the Marie Curie Couch, the podcast that aims to break down taboos and start open, honest conversations about death and dying. I'm Jason Davidson. I'm a social worker by profession, and I've worked in palliative care, hospice care, and bereavement support services for more than a decade. Each episode, we'll be speaking to a well-known guest to find out about how they feel about their own mortality and how their personal experience of bereavement has shaped the way they live their life. Today, I'm on the Marie Curie couch with Sophie Ellis Bextor. Sophie's a singer-songwriter who's had a hugely successful international pop career, famously collaborating with DJ Spiller on Groovejet, If This Ain't Love, which topped the charts in the UK, Ireland, Australia, and New Zealand. Other hits, including Murder on the Dance Floor and Take Me Home, have cemented her position as pop royalty. During lockdown, Sophie hosted a series of regular kitchen discos on Instagram Live, featuring cameos from her 5 young sons and husband Richard. Sophie Ellis Bextor, welcome to the Marie Curie couch.
Hey there, Jason.
Can I start, Sophie, by asking you to tell us about the significant bereavement you've experienced in your life?
Well, I guess for me, that would be my stepdad, John. He died last July. It wasn't a big surprise. He'd been diagnosed with lung cancer 2 years before that. But it's kind of coloured, I'd say, the last year in whatever shade grief is.
Can we go back to when your stepdad, John, was first diagnosed? Can you tell us about how you heard about it? What kind of conversations you were having as a family?
Yeah, so John had throat cancer before and then had the all clear. He just received radiotherapy for that, and it seemed to be relatively tidy to get the other side of that cancer. So he and my mum had been back to their normal pace of life and preparing themselves to go away and all other manner of adventures that they normally do. And as it got to Christmas time, John had gone for one of his routine checkups, and he had been feeling a little bit of, I don't know, something on one side of his lungs, but I don't think he thought it was, I think he was hoping it wasn't hugely significant. But the scan revealed, what was really going on. So my mum called me and she said that John had stage 4 lung cancer and it was secondary cancer. And so I did a bit of Googling and I realised pretty quickly what kind of a picture I was looking at. And I think it was just sort of disbelief, really. We're a very open family and very communicative and spend a lot of time together. My mum only lives 10 minutes away from where I live. So, I see a lot of her. And throughout John's treatment, we spent a lot of time together and it was quite sort of matter of fact, I guess. I didn't feel too squeamish about asking him how he's doing and what was happening with treatment and all that side of things. But I'm sure anyone who's been through similar experience knows it's just very hard to get your head around.
Mm-hmm. How about with your own family? I know you've got children of your own. Were you having open conversations with them as well at the time?
Yeah, I was actually. I'm trying to think of the chronology of events now. I'm pretty sure I would have been pregnant when John was diagnosed. I've got 5 kids, so I'm usually pregnant somewhere around any big life event. But let's imagine my youngest, Mickey, throughout the treatment, he was very, very small. He's only 2 now, all the way up to my eldest, Sonny, who's now 17. And yes, I think because when I was a kid, I felt like death and conversations around that and severe illness were maybe not spoken to me in a way that always made sense to me. So it was very important to me that my children, they could ask me pretty open questions. I'd answer them with as much truth as I thought was appropriate. Or rather, I'd always put truth in there, but always make it, in the sort of level that would make sense to them and not scare them too much, but just, I suppose, gently prepare themselves for the fact that, I knew what the end of the story would be. And I wanted them to kind of be aware of that too, so that they could make sense of their time with grandpa and grandma within that context, that it wasn't something that would last forever.
And I think that's one of the things people struggle with, certainly in my experience in my work. When there are young children, and for parents, whether it's a parent or a grandparent or friend, neighbour, whoever's living with a terminal illness, is how do you tell them? How do you begin those conversations, and what do you tell them? And I think what you've just said, certainly something we would recommend as well, is to allow them to ask the questions and go at their pace, and also kind of pitch it at an understandable level, not give too much information as well, not use any sort of complicated information. Because I think it's interesting what you were just saying there about when you were younger, those sort of messages around death might not have necessarily made much sense.
No, but I think there were a couple of lessons I learned. My grandma, so my maternal grandma, she died when I was 11. And firstly, I did not understand how ill she was. And that really haunted me, I think. I just didn't understand it. I don't think anyone had said, she's incredibly ill, and one day this will probably most likely be how she dies, and it probably won't be that far away. So actually, the night that I last saw her, I'd gone around after school with my mum, and I was complaining about having a tummy ache. And on the way home, my mum said to me, you probably shouldn't really complain too much when you have a tummy ache, because actually grandma's a lot sicker than you. And then actually she died that night. And obviously the memory is the funny thing. It's incredibly possible it wasn't that night, but in my head, that's when it was. And then after that, I didn't really cry very much. And I remember feeling like I'd got that bit wrong, and that I was supposed to have been manifesting a lot more outward sadness than I was. So actually with John, I said the same thing to the kids. I said, if you feel sad, that's okay. And if you don't, that's okay as well. Because I think for me, it was really important that they didn't worry about their reactions to it. They could let the feelings come and go. And if it was a big deal to them, that was okay. And if it wasn't, that was completely okay too. And I think I've seen it now firsthand. Most of my kids did not get overly emotionally sad when we spoke about it. So I now realize that my own response back then probably wasn't that unusual, but I felt very self-conscious about it, and I wanted to make sure they were totally alleviated of that.
We know as well for young people, and as you've just described, they, may feel sad for a moment or for, 10 minutes, but then there's something else, and those emotions kind of can go up and down, can't they? Actually, can be like that for adults as well.
Definitely.
So John was living 2 years with his illness, with his cancer, and just moving forward to when he started to become a lot less well, and that he started to die. Was there, had he spoken about what his wishes were for his end of life? Do you know?
He hadn't actually. No. So I suppose this is the three parts to that, really. Up until the first lockdown, actually, he and my mum were still pretty active. They went on a big trip to Japan. They managed to buy a very lovely little place in a little Italian town called Modica in Sicily. So they were kind of admirably just sort of getting on with stuff. And honestly, if you saw the place they bought, you wouldn't say that one of the people buying that little place had lung cancer. It's up about 60 or 70 steps to get to this little place they have. And I loved all that. It was really them. It was really them, that they were still living life in whatever capacity they could. So actually, when John first got really sick, it was actually sort of all cloaked with lockdown, really. And so suddenly he couldn't go anywhere anyway. So the fact that actually in reality he was probably struggling to get to the end of the garden to sit in the sunshine and have his tea, I don't think the significance of it was really apparent to all of us. But then by the time he did get really ill, we were actually able to go and be with him in hospital, that kind of thing. I think probably the last 6 weeks it was all quite like we could see what was happening. But then actually the day that he died, we found there was a letter that he'd written, and that had all of his wishes. And actually it was an amazing gift, that letter, because the tone of it was completely him. And it was probably the most, I don't know, transparently emotional thing he'd ever done. He wasn't really like a very romantic sort of demonstrative man in that way. So this letter was really lovely because it kind of gave us a bit of a shape to how he would help us through that first bit of grief in a way. And I really appreciated it. I took a lot of comfort from that.
So he'd not really, he'd not, as far as you know, he'd not really had conversations about his end of life wishes and what he wanted. The reason I'm asking that is we encourage people as a charity. We encourage people to have those conversations about death and dying, because we know even on a practical level, that kind of planning for the future can make the experience, can support the experience when it comes for those who are affected by it.
Yeah, so I guess, and so far as to answer your question, I think that there were definitely conversations that I was party to where it was talking about aspects of palliative care and whether we'd like to be at home or in hospital and those kind of things. But in terms of a more sort of practical thing in terms of like funeral plans and all this, I don't think, I didn't get the impression that he and my mum had spoken about that a lot. And she told me subsequently that sometimes she'd try and ask questions about afterwards and he would just say, oh, we're not talking about that now. But I think he was a practical man, so I think his paperwork had been very in order. He'd been very good about looking out for the financial side of how things would work out for my mum. So yeah, there was definitely a lot of those things, but it just wasn't something that I wasn't having a lot of the conversations with him directly myself.
Yeah. And can you tell us about his death at the end?
Yeah, it was an extraordinary time, really, because when we first realized, that was where we were at. In normal circumstances at that time of year, it'd be quite likely that probably my brother, he's a drummer, I'm a singer, my husband's a bass player, we'd probably have been away quite a lot of that time. It was all sort of beginning of the summer, so July kind of time, and often we'd be away for a lot of work. And I think because everything had been shut down, we could all be together. And I really appreciate that we had that time. So on the day before he actually died, we were all together all day, playing music, talking, sometimes laughing, a lot of crying, obviously. And it was just, I think, families go through all sorts of things, but I think whatever dynamic you have there at the root and however you interact with each other and all that love and support that is there effortlessly through the good days, it really comes into amazing play when you're going through something tough, and it becomes this sort of structure that's just quietly there. So none of us there was no tension. I didn't feel there was anything that needed to be said. There was nothing I needed to hear. We could just be. And I'm sure for a lot of families, there's all sorts of stuff that gets churned up when you're in that sort of situation. And I'm just so grateful that wasn't our experience of it. We could just be sad or reminisce or whatever came naturally without any sort of question mark over anything else we should be sorting or someone else annoying us or anything. So yeah, there's lots of music I could listen to now that would take me straight back to that moment. And I actually I asked the kids if they wanted to FaceTime their grandpa, and I explained to them that, this would be a chance to say goodbye if they wanted to. And some of them wanted to, some of them didn't, and that was fine. And the two that did, I was really impressed with them actually, because they were very good at articulating stuff. And I think the youngest one, Ray, he was 8. And so I said, look, Grandpa is going to look a bit strange because he's asleep, but he can hear you. And then Ray was, I'm sorry to hear you might die, Grandpa, and I love you. And I was just really proud of him because I thought he did it in quite an unflinching way with a lot of clarity. And I think, you don't get any training for that kind of stuff. And my mum was extraordinary. And the next day, she phoned us very, very early to say that John had died. I think it was around 6 a.m. And so me, my brother and sister and my mum, so Jack, Martha and I all went. We had about an hour with John. And it was sometimes quite mundane, working out which bits and bobs from his little hospital side table we should take home, and just keep the half-used toothpaste and that kind of thing. And then some of it very sad, of course. And then some of it really, really quite profound. And I don't think my mum would mind me sharing that, but there was a part where, as we were leaving, my mum just put her hands on either side of John on his shoulders and just sort of said thank you to his body for carrying him. And it was very beautiful and very sad. Yeah, I felt so much that so much of my emotion about John and my sense of family, at the heart of it all really is the love story of my mum and John. And that was kind of the stone from which all the concentric circles came out of, really. And I felt that it was extraordinary privilege to sort of see the end of that journey as it is at the moment. So yeah, it was a really incredible thing to witness, really.
I love that when you were talking about that kind of structure, and I was thinking about, that essentially was the sort of love in the room. And I was thinking about this foundation, actually, the kind of foundations it was sitting on. And but I was also thinking about, it sounded like there was an acceptance as well of what was happening, an acceptance that John was dying. And I just wonder what difference that makes in that room at that time for everybody who's there. If there's some acceptance of what's going on, whether that's your 8-year-old accepting it as well and talking about it, and all of you. I do know that not everybody has that experience. And I think the acceptance that it's coming, or that it's real and that death's going to happen, it's a tough one, it's a really tricky one, isn't it? Of course you don't want it, but you're experiencing it.
Yeah. And I think, that there was, I wouldn't say I would apply the word acceptance to my initial reaction when I found out about the diagnosis. I felt really quite angry about it, actually. And, you walk along a street and see all manner of people who look way more senior than John, and you think, why doesn't he get that extra decade, 2 decades, 3 decades? But ultimately things just happen to people, and who's to say it couldn't have been much shorter than that. Yeah, I suppose there was acceptance, and with my kids as well, I just really wanted them to know that when they look back on it all, that they understood what was happening. I'd hate them to think that they didn't really get it and they didn't have the opportunity to do what made it right for them. So yeah, I did say, like there was one time just before John went into hospital, I said, we're going to go around, and it's probably the last time that you're going to see him in person. So they all went in one by one and had a little bit of time with Grandpa, and then ditto that last day in the hospital as well. I don't want them to have any regrets about it. It's a really unhelpful emotion. So I was keen to support that as much as possible. Yeah, I don't know. It's just a weird thing to go through, really. It's going to happen, but I have to say the diagnosis doesn't make a massive difference to how grief feels on the other side, because I don't think you can ever put yourself there, and you feel like you might be jinxing things to even imagine it before it's time anyway, which I know is nonsensical, but it's just that feeling of, so I remember just before John, maybe in the last week or something, and we'd all started having conversations about, okay, I think, we're in the last bit now. And then you suddenly get a WhatsApp message from John, and you're thinking, oh God, I'm already thinking about that, and they're here, and it just felt really wrong. So you sort of put all that side of everything on pause in your head, and then find yourself just going through it in a slightly zombie-like fashion when you're on the other side, I think.
Talking about the other side, can you tell us about John's funeral?
So at the time of the funeral, legally, I think 16 people were allowed. And we felt actually that not being able to have a big funeral gave us the opportunity to have one that was incredibly small, and actually felt really nice, because John was a very loved person, lots of friends, lots of people who would like to pay tribute to him, but we just had that for ourselves, and actually I quite liked that. So the funeral was just my mum, my brother and his girlfriend, my sister and her boyfriend, me and my husband Richard, the 5 kids. That was it, really. And we just sat in this little chapel, and we didn't want a great deal of formality. And initially there was talk about us all reading out a reading or reading a letter to John, whatever we wanted to. And then in the end, even that didn't feel like we needed to do that, really. I mean, who were we performing to? It was only the people in the room. We'd had all those conversations with each other anyway. So we all wrote letters, or the kids did drawings or wrote whatever they wanted to, and then played 45 minutes of music. And whenever we felt like it, one of us would just go up and put whatever we'd written onto the coffin. So by the end, it was all piled high with all the little bits of paper and drawings and things. And Ray was dressed, he was the 8-year-old, he was dressed as a cowboy. And, you know, it's probably quite distressing for the kids to see everybody sad, but at the same time, I'd sort of warn them about that. And then the little ones all went home, and then all of the, you know, all the adults and my eldest, we all went for a nice lunch by the river, which we were able to do at the time. And it was a really beautiful, hot, sunny day. So we sort of walked there, and yeah, it was peaceful. It was very peaceful. The whole day was pretty peaceful.
I just like that kind of having something to do as well in the funeral, you know, especially thinking about the children, but actually writing letters, or, you know, and getting up off your seat and walking to the front and putting something on top of the coffin, just making everybody involved. And yeah, I think certainly for young people and adults, I guess that's probably just makes it a kind of nicer experience, rather than the potential formality of something where, you know, you might not be allowed to move, or you know, you might just think you have to stay silent.
Yeah, that wouldn't have felt right. Yeah, and I was thinking about it as we were talking. It's, you know, I feel very lucky, really, because John was at my wedding. He's met all my children, but for my brother and sister, they haven't got to that bit yet. So I suppose, I felt like I was in quite a sort of protective role, really. I feel like they've got all those life experiences to come, and it'll be very significant that John won't be there for it. He was only 63 when he died, which obviously still seems pretty senior to my children, I'm sure, but it's not really.
And I think there's something in that, you know, which we do talk about on this podcast, but also talk about with the individuals and families we meet through our work, is that everybody's experience of it will be different, because your relationship with the individual was different. So everyone's experience of grief's unique, you know, because it's kind of based on you as a stepdaughter and the relationship you had with your stepdad. You know, that's going to inform your experience of bereavement and grief, isn't it?
Yeah, that's very true. And I suppose, you know, the step parent thing is an interesting one, because obviously, I mean, like any family dynamic, to some people they can imagine what John would have meant to me, you know, but to other people, they might think, okay, not your real dad. But the nice thing is I never needed to explain or articulate any of that stuff to the people that were in the room when we were at the funeral, or to John, or any of that stuff. It just was. And it was nice not to have any question marks about the strength of my feelings, if that makes sense.
Yeah, of course it does. Do you feel that exists? Is that a thing?
I suppose I only really had one comment from a friend, and it was not it was well-meaning, but she said, you know, oh, your poor brother and sister, you know, I know you've lost a stepdad, but that's their dad. And it just really stayed with me a little bit. And I think, you know, if you're a child that then becomes part of two new families, so I have a step parent on both sides, there's always a slight feeling that people might think that you're slightly the one slightly on the outside of that. And it doesn't come from inside the family walls. It's just a sort of, I don't know, yeah, just a feeling you sometimes get. But yes, you're right. And if we had read letters out loud, then that actually was what I was planning on talking about, and saying, you know, I met John when I was 7, and we had to learn our relationship together. And actually that became the real beauty of what emerged from it, actually, is that we had something that was just our own, and we learned it ourselves.
How was that learning period when you came into your life at 7 and you first met?
Oh, quite funny. So when I met John, I wasn't sure about him at all. He was from Huddersfield and quite unfamiliar with small people. I don't think he'd ever met a child, really. I don't think he'd certainly not spent that much time with any small people. and he had a very northern, dry humour. So for our first Christmas, which I think was only a few months in, he gave me a packet of balloons that said "Happy Birthday, Jane," which I really didn't get at all. And I said to my mum afterwards, "I don't like John." Well, actually, I didn't say it. I wrote it down because I felt like I needed to tell her. And looking back, my mum must have already been pregnant with my brother, because she got pregnant with him when they'd only been out for 3 months. And she handled it really well. She laughed a little bit, but then said, "Look, I trust me on this one. I think he's a good person." And actually, we never had any wobbles after that. It was all fine. And Jack was born when I was 8. And from thereafter, really, Mum, John, Jack, that was family, and a really happy home. And I did obviously still go and see my dad and my stepmom. But John, very, very smartly, and I give this advice to anybody that's stepping into the role of step parent, he never, ever got involved in any of the dynamic between my mum and my dad. He never said an unkind word about my dad, never slagged him off. And it's just definitely the way forward. It pays back dividends, I promise.
The coronavirus pandemic has triggered a wave of bereavement across the country and taken away our ability to be with loved ones and grieve in traditional ways. Marie Curie's new Memory Cloud is an online space to reflect on a loved one's life and share special memories with your friends and family. Visit memorycloud.org.uk.
I know it hasn't been very long since John died. Can you tell us about your experience of grief and what's helped you or is helping you?
So I suppose, what have I learned? I mean, I feel that first feeling of grief was just, it's like a blur when I look back. I felt like I was wearing a cloak, and in some ways I still am. It's just that you don't see it so much these days. But at that time I felt very much like I was almost wearing it like a coat, and it was heavy, and some days would really slow me down, and other days it would sort of alleviate for a bit, but then you pick up, it was like a magic coat that could kind of sometimes be transparent and sometimes be very made of something very heavy. But I think the thing I found I struggled with the most is actually probably watching people I love going through it and not being able to really fundamentally help them. And especially for my mum, I was always so worried about this bit, and she's been brilliant and kept herself really busy, and she's someone that's read billions of books on grief, and so she sort of knew a bit about what you're supposed to be doing with yourself and making plans and walking the dog, and she walks for miles and gets out into nature and all of that. But it's been very tough to know that she goes home to an empty house, and I couldn't change it. I couldn't make it so that John was here again. And she writes about grief. She's very good at articulating herself. So she'll either tell me and my brother and sister, or she sometimes writes these Instagram posts that totally floor me. They're beautiful, but they're heartbreaking. And I think she'll make it into something bigger one day. She's been writing a bit of poetry, and I think she could well write a book that involves her talking about all that. So she has got the language, and that helps. But I just can't undo what's happened.
And you're all finding your way through.
Exactly. And she did say that she wants to be her sort of best version of herself in tribute to John, really. And I think that's really lovely. I think it's a nice idea that you can harness the love that came from a relationship to sort of fuel you through the next bit. And with every death I've ever experienced, it always makes me think about how really the meaning of life is who you've loved and who's loved you, because I feel like it sort of continues and gets passed on like a baton. So, yeah, I think I can see that in action. But yes, you're right, it's still pretty recent.
Is there anything in your experience of grief that you've found helpful that you could tell others?
I suppose keeping conversations open, talking about it whenever you want to. I think it's helped me sort of dismantle any remaining awkwardness I might have had about talking about death, really. And I want to be really good at that for other people. I want to make sure I'm a good friend when people are going through things. So yeah, I think just a lot of it is just turning on your back and floating, but that is okay. And there are people around to help you. So just, yeah, keep the conversation open. I think that's probably the main thing. And just give yourself permission that chronology really can go out the window. It doesn't really work like that. And I've had to talk to my kids about that too. One of them in particular has definitely taken an impact from it. And, you know, I've taken him to see a counsellor because I think it just really shocked him, this idea that someone can just be removed from a life. I suppose just being open to letting all the feelings come. I definitely find going for walks and keeping things quite simple has really helped me. I found at the beginning there was nowhere I could go to anything social or see lots of people, and I think that's all fine. No pressure. It's a big deal. It's a big deal. Be kind to yourself.
I think what will also be helpful, which I really liked, is that image of the magic cloak. Because I liked how you described how it changes. And so, you know, there are times when it will feel really heavy.
Yeah.
And then there are times when it feels almost kind of transparent and a bit lighter, and it sort of changes sort of color.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think those things are really helpful to hear, you know, when you're experiencing it, certainly if you're experiencing it for the first time, because it can sometimes feel like it's never going to change, and, you know, those kind of, in the depths of it, not easy at all.
No, but it does definitely shift. You're right. It does definitely shift. And, you know, at first you think, oh, I won't be able to bring it up without, you know, being incredibly vulnerable very quickly. But actually now I feel like, you know, I can bring back a sort of slightly more lightness of touch in how I can weave stories about John or memories of John into my everyday life without it always coming with the cloak going very heavy. Yeah.
I realise as well on this podcast, you know, we have people who come and join us on the Marie Curie couch, and actually, you know, it might not be very often that those individuals, including yourself, end up having a long conversation about the experience of somebody's death, no matter kind of when that happened. Because, yeah, well, we're sort of busy, and I think, as you say, you might not want to have it all the time, and you might kind of dip in and out of it.
It's fine. It is a nice thing to talk about too, because it's still very recent, and I think you do get a slight sort of post-trauma association with the memories of certainly the final bit. You know, it's so visceral, that bit when you're in the hospital and gelling your hands and the people coming in and out and just getting your head around all of it. And yeah, sometimes I can suddenly be right back there, and that's not very nice. But I've also been writing about it a bit, and I think that helps too for me. Anyway, I've been writing a book, and so I wrote a whole chapter on grief. And I think just being able to sort of be peaceful and slightly go through the thoughts has been quite nice for me too.
Just to kind of change tack a bit, I wanted to ask whether you think about your own death, and whether you've had conversations with your family, whether it's you, your husband, about kind of plans for the future or wishes at the end of life.
Nothing really structured. I've sort of sometimes said about songs I'd quite like played, but they're all songs that I don't think are very funerally, like Hey Mickey by Tony Basil, which I decided when I was really little. I don't think I'd choose it if I was just at the starting point of now, but to honour my small self, I feel like I should still include it. But to be honest, I don't really mind. I sort of trust and hope that my loved ones will do what works for them, really. I don't really feel like the funeral's for me, it's for them. So I'm okay with all that. I don't really feel like I need, I mean, my mum's like, she wants us all to wear black for 10 years and it's all got to be very dramatic. I don't feel like I need to impose that on anyone. It's fine. I'm quite relaxed about that aspect of life, the bit where I'm not in it.
And what about practical things like writing a will?
I think I did that when I was much younger, and I only had one kid and probably hadn't moved houses many times, that kind of thing. So maybe when I was about, I think Richard and I had to do it actually. I think maybe when Sonny was little. So maybe, about 16 years ago. So we should probably have another look at it. I don't have a problem with the idea of it. I'm not particularly squeamish about it. It's just that there's so many other things I'm doing in the here and now, which are a bit more pressing, or potentially more pressing. If life stays predictable, then more pressing.
Absolutely. I think that's a good point, though. 'Cause I think with, certainly for families, for those who've not written a will, they might not know that they can include in their will, their wishes for who's going to kind of care for the family, who's going to care for the children afterwards, and what some of those arrangements might be. And also people can include just kind of basic, in my will, I've put in some just sort of basic funeral wishes. The fact that I want cremated and not buried, it's that kind of, you can include some of those things in there as well. And I think at least they're documented, because of course there are endless stories of people in situations when a death happened and there's no will, or there's nothing documented, or nothing's written down, no conversations have taken place. And that's when, everybody's got an opinion, and those opinions might not always match.
I think I've said about, cremated would be preferable too. But I suppose I feel like that's probably just what they do anyway, but maybe they wouldn't. Maybe it would turn into an argument. I'll make sure I write it down somewhere. I'll put it in my notes on my computer. It should be one note and just say cremated. I'll keep it quite vague.
Absolutely. You can maybe put it in your book.
Yeah, exactly. All right, I'll just put it in there. That's a good idea. Yeah. Funeral wishes. That's just not a bad idea. I'll get to it.
So is the book about your sort of own experiences, or?
It's an autobiography, so I've been able to write about whatever I want to, really. But I think my relationship with grief has probably been it's something I was keen to write about, because probably of the significance of that time when I was young and my grandma dying and feeling like I got it wrong. And it was something that I really carried with me. And I felt like maybe I was a bit cold or a bit heartless because I hadn't got very upset. And I remember about a year after my grandma died, I was reading a book, and the end of the book was very sad, and I started crying. And my stepmom came in and saw me, and she said, "Oh, you're crying. That's good. I thought maybe you couldn't." And now looking back, she might have meant you're letting out some of the emotion about your grandma. But I thought she meant that she literally thought she didn't think I was capable of it. And that really startled me. Whereas actually now I realize I probably miss my grandma more now than I did as a child, because I now see all the times and all the experiences she would have been party to. So I think it was fine that I didn't really get it at the time. I think I was probably busy being 11 and going to a new school and had a new sister born and all these other things that were happening around then. I wish I hadn't felt that pressure, actually.
And some grown-ups worry about those things, don't they? I think it's like, oh, she's not crying.
Yeah.
She's bottling it all up.
But it's fine.
Yeah, of course.
It's fine. Also, you can talk to kids about it. They're actually, giving them the language of how to talk about their feelings is a brilliant gift in all directions. So I'm very hot on that, really. But also giving permission to feel what you feel. It's okay. You can't force yourself to feel something you're not feeling anyway.
And what you don't want to do is leave a child, like you've described, feeling like they've done something wrong or they haven't got it right.
Exactly. Yeah. No, I know. Plus, there's different levels of things. There's when people die in your family at the expected order of things, it's grandparents first, and that's a very different thing to a tragedy that might be someone dying at a different time or when they're very young. Or I think there's also different. There's probably slightly different rooms of grief as well. And I know I spoke to this woman called Carrie Ad Lloyd. You know her? She does a podcast called Griefcast, and
yeah.
She and I were talking about that and about how, anyone that's experienced loss of a child, that's got its own space, really. That's a very different thing. And I think it's okay to acknowledge that as well.
So these are the different rooms. Yeah, I like that.
Yeah, so I think of it in my head anyway.
Last two questions. One is, You've already sort of touched on these and spoken about them really, but I just wonder if there's anything else. If, thinking about our listeners who, we hear back from people that they find the podcast useful, helpful, supportive when they're either caring for somebody who's dying, who's terminally ill, or when they're grieving themselves. And is there any sort of words that helped you through either of those times, through either when John was dying or then now throughout your grief?
If you're in that situation and you're listening in, I think you're already giving yourself a brilliant thing there by just being open to other people's stories and remembering that it can feel incredibly isolating and overwhelming, but you are not the first person to experience those things. And there are people out there that are willing to listen if you want to speak, or they're willing to talk if you want to listen. So have those conversations or listen into them and things like podcasts or books. I think sometimes even hearing someone or reading someone articulate a feeling that you're struggling to articulate yourself can be immensely helpful. So much of it is about just letting that feeling be. Not everything needs to be fixed or solved. And if something's very sad, it's okay just to acknowledge it's really sad. In fact, I remember when John had first died, I felt like the English language is really sometimes so unhelpful. Sad can mean so many things, as can love. And sometimes just wanting those little nuances that just help you pinpoint what you're going through a little better can be really helpful. So probably just, look out for yourself in that way and curate for yourself a world that means that you're seeing things reflected back at you that help you in that way. So even if you're not lucky enough to have someone at the end of the phone or someone at home that can be that sounding board, there are still voices you can hear that can give you that comfort, I think, and utilize that. And I think, yes, just being kind to yourself. We can sometimes feel like there's so many expectations of how to act and what to be keeping up with. But actually, when big things happen in your life, they don't happen over and over again. These significant events are sprinkled throughout a lifetime. So you can really just take time for that big thing to happen and unfold. You can feel like you've got to sort of hurry up to get back to where you were. But actually, how many times do you lose a parent, a sibling, someone you love? It's not an everyday thing. So you don't have to behave every day about it, I don't think.
What did it mean to you to come on this podcast today, Sophie?
I suppose a few things, really. It's nice to talk about John. It's nice to check in on myself, if I'm honest. I don't often have time just to sit back and think about how I'm really feeling about all those things, because life has kind of started to move on. Actually, that's another thing that I think is worth noting. It's quite hard when you're grieving someone and the first few new things happen afterwards that you normally would have told them about. It can kind of give your grief a little shake again, I think. You think, I would have loved to have shared that with them. And the idea that the world has started to move forward is quite a thing. But anyway, I think, just checking in with that, hearing your very calm voice, soothing. And I suppose I have got an interest in talking about things that don't always come easy. So I think it's quite healthy to keep having those conversations. Like I said before, it's really important to me that I can be the friend my friends have been to me when they're going through it. And I want to learn from that, the language of it, and also how to what kind of things are helpful. I don't really talk about it that much, really, but it's nice to. It is nice.
Sophie Ellis Bextor, thank you for joining me on the Marie Curie couch today. Thank you for sharing your story. Thank you for telling us about John. And I hope you have a great day.
You too. Thank you for having me on the couch. And I might stay while I finish my tea.
So that's all for this episode of On the Marie Curie Couch. We hope it's got you thinking about matters of life and death, and perhaps starting those conversations with your own friends and family. Marie Curie's here to help. From planning ahead to coping with bereavement, You can talk through any concerns you have around the end of life with our support line team, which also includes specially trained nurses. Call us on 0800 080 2309 or search Marie Curie online. The podcast's produced and edited by Marie Curie with support from Ultimate Sound and Vision, and the music featured is Time Lapse by Panoceanic. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please do like and subscribe. Thanks for listening, and until next time, goodbye.